Hi everyone, today I'm going to be summarizing and analyzing a 2007 case study written by Gray and Smith called Copyright in the Computer, Regulations Governing Technology. So to start, I am going to summarize the case. Keith Sample, principal of St. Regis' K-8 school, is facing a copyright dilemma. Over the past 3 years, St. Regis School has fundraised enough money to purchase 20 new computers that are housed in the school's computer lab. Mrs. Lynn, St. Regis' library and media specialist, worked with the school's teacher as well as Principal Sample to determine what software programs would be most beneficial for each grade level based on alignment with instructional objectives. So, as the computer lab and therefore the new software programs became more popular among grade level teachers, they began to request copies of the software programs to use in their own classroom. Happy to oblige, Mrs. Lynn created CD copies of the software programs to distribute to each teacher at St. Regis. Mrs. Williams, a veteran teacher, was thrilled to have received a personal copy. Mrs. Brandon, a new teacher at St. Regis this year, had a different reaction. Mrs. Brandon was well aware of the copyright violations that took place in order to make the copies and was concerned about the overall legality of the situation. Mrs. Lynn argued that by making the CD copies of the software program, the school would save money by making the new programs accessible to every teacher and student. Mrs. Lynn also mentioned that even the school's PTA president, Mrs. Evans, volunteered to help make the CD copies and was pleased to see that the school was maximizing the use of PTA dollars. Mr. Sample is aware of the violation and of the copyright as well as the potential consequences for the school district, and Mrs. Lynn if discovered by the publisher, and requested that Mrs. Lynn collect all of the illegal copies and stop making any more. And it is important to note that this came to Mr. Sample's attention from Mrs. Brandon because she was aware of the copyright regulations from her previous school before she came to St. Regis. So moving on, we move to the legal and ethical issues of this case study. Mrs. Lynn is not acknowledging nor following the licensing restrictions associated with the computer software. Therefore, her actions are violating the 1976 U.S. Copyright Act. That is the most relevant legal or law regulation in place here that is being violated. As mentioned by Principal Sample, the consequences for distributing copyrighted materials could not only impact the school, but could also impact the entire school district, as well as Mrs. Lynn if discovered by the publishers. And then in addition to potential consequences if the school is caught, other harm is done to the relationships between Mrs. Lynn, Mrs. Brandon, and Mr. Sample. Although it does not seem as though there was a breach of contract, other than the replication and distribution of the copyrighted software, Mr. Sample ignored the situation, then it is possible that inappropriate actions or comments, impelled by differing opinions, may escalate to a point of breaching contract. So, yes, Mrs. Lynn had some few choice words about how she didn't care about Mrs. Brandon's past school and their regulations, but that being said, it hadn't escalated to the point of a contract breach, but it could. Next, I'm going to go ahead and just summarize it again, just in one sweet sentence. Despite having good intentions, Mrs. Lynn, the library and media specialist for St. Regis' K-8 school, illegally distributed and copyrighted copies of the school's newly purchased software programs. Here's my fact synthesis. So for the people, Mr. Keith Sample, the St. Regis' principal, Mrs. Lynn, St. Regis' library and media specialist, Mrs. Brandon, the newbie teacher at St. Regis, Mrs. Williams, the veteran teacher at St. Regis, and then Mrs. Evans, St. Regis' PTA president. It's important to make sure and include her as well in this synthesis because the money that is being used for the software programs comes from the PTA, and then as well as she helped make the copies for distribution. And then the place, St. Regis is in a rural community, 25 miles from a large city, and then St. Regis is a K-8 school. And then the overall program at St. Regis, it's a public school, approximately 420 students, 2 teachers per grade level, 2 special education teachers, 1 grades K-4, the other 4 grades 5-8. And then when students enter high school, they are transported to a high school in the city. So there is not a high school in St. Regis itself. They have to be transported outside. And then financial support comes mostly from fundraising. So that's another important aspect that the PTA becomes involved in. And then the information review. Due to the legality of the situation, the decision made by Principal Sample could potentially be damaging to stakeholders as well as the community if handled inappropriately. Those directly affected would be St. Regis' superintendent as well as the school board and the individuals from the community that volunteer their time and efforts for school programs, especially members of the school's PTA. That being said, St. Regis' superintendent and the school board must be consulted prior to finalizing a decision. This step is necessary in order to double and triple check with school board policies and district contracts. Then, based on the information obtained from a consultation with the school board and the superintendent, the school must inform the PTA president of their reasoning behind the final decision. So, that being said, we have to get the superintendent as well as the school board involved in this issue due to the overall legality. And then here are a few of the different options that you could take, or I could take if I was in Mr. Sample's position. Option number 1 is don't make any rash decisions. Just let Mrs. Lynn actions slide and see if anything happens at all. The consequence that could come from this decision is the publisher is informed of the incident, either by an anonymous tip, it could be Mrs. Brandon, or they could just have technology that recognizes when their copyright is being violated and decides to sue the school and school district as well as Mrs. Lynn. So worst case scenario, if Mr. Keith Sample ignores the situation, then there could just be a whole lot of suing from the publisher, suing the school district, as well as Mrs. Lynn. Option number 2, have Mrs. Lynn obtain permission from the publisher to distribute the materials so long as attribution is provided. This is just really important. If you do make copies and then distribute those copies, you have to attribute the publisher. And then the consequence could be that the publisher denies permission to distribute the materials. If teachers demand individual copies, the school will have to find a different program as well as additional funds. So if they decide to go in a different direction, they'll have to fundraise even more money, which could be pretty devastating to the PTA as well as other fundraising programs for the school. They might just feel defeated at that point. Option 3, destroy the copies that have already been made and terminate production of any more copies. So this was kind of the step or the option that Mr. Sample was taking at the end of the case study. Mrs. Lynn objects to the decision and feels unappreciated. She then goes to the PTA to state her case. If the PTA supports Mrs. Lynn in her actions, they could then refuse further financial support. So again, that goes back to the relationship between Mrs. Lynn and Mr. Sample. If she just feels completely unappreciated and therefore her efforts no longer deem a purpose, she might just encourage the PTA to withhold funds for any further financial support. And then option number 4, take the case to the school board to review the school board policies as well as the software programs policy as a team. If the school board policy lacks guidance, determine what revisions need to be made to avoid similar future situations. And then the consequence could be if the school board determines Mrs. Lynn's actions as a breach of policies, it is possible that she could be dismissed from her position. Additionally, the school board would have to hold an emergency meeting to revise insufficient policies. So again, worst case scenario, Mrs. Lynn would have to be dismissed from her position. But since this seems to be the first and only case with Mrs. Lynn involved, that might not necessarily have to occur, but it would have to change the policies so that she is aware as well as the PTA is aware of making sure that they don't fall into this copyright situation again. And then here are some evaluating my options. The pros: any concerns from all involved parties are reflected on and communicated one way or another in order to promote student and adult success and well-being, so that collaboration. New understanding of copyright will develop from evaluating the situation, resulting in improved implementation. So overall, we're just being progressive. And then the last pro is progressive collaborative efforts will strengthen leadership platform. And then the cons: additional steps might need to be taken to make a plan for ensuring that the school board's policies are consistent with copyright laws and regulations. Just that inconvenience part of it. Veteran staff members might feel unsure about new approaches, and the tension between coworkers might arise, creating negative working conditions. So again, the relationships between Mr. Sample, Mrs. Lynn, Mrs. Brandon, Mrs. William, all of those involved might be affected. And then the best option is option 4. Again, that's just taking it to the school board to review the policies and revise if necessary. This is the best option because all stakeholders are involved, including community members. They are more than welcome to attend the board meeting. Determining revisions to current school policies ensures up-to-date and progressive guidance. And then PTA members could and should attend the school board meeting too. So again, it just goes back to everyone involved can attend the meeting and have their say. And then decision implementation. First, I will notify the school board of the situation and request a meeting to discuss what actions need to be taken place. Then I will inform Mrs. Lynn that the school board will be meeting to determine what steps need to be taken to ensure that she as well as school will be protected. So again, it's not threatening her, it's just saying we need to do this so that we are protected as well as she is protected. And then if the school board deems it necessary to revise current school board policies, I will request that Mrs. Lynn as well as Mrs. Evans attend the meeting too. So just making sure everyone is involved in getting the word out that they should be there. And then plan B, if the school board does not deem it necessary to revise current school policies, I will consult with St. Regis' school faculty to determine a plan accepted by all parties regarding the implementation of software program usage. So just breaking it down into our own school and having our own school-wide initiative, our own school-wide plan, instead of having the school board decide for the entire district. And then this plan, just like a revised school board policy, would ensure that all stakeholders are aware of technology regulations in order to protect the school and its members from legal situations. And then last but not least, my reflection, Module 12 introduced the challenges associated with being a school administrator and balancing what is right and what is desired. I learned that when it comes to decisions that require legal caution, it is best to address the situations in leadership groups or teams so that all parties involved can provide input and are informed of final decisions. This assignment will impact my future as a school leader because I now have a better understanding of how to address copyright and collaborate with other education stakeholders in order to ensure the creation and implementation of progressive and up-to-date school board policies. And then here are my references and my credits for this presentation.